Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in the history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we start, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time you heard this story. We want to know when and where these documented accounts come in. A string of disappearances in the fall of 1937 shook the small remote community of Ravens Hollow in western North Carolina. These disappearances would later be linked to one of the most disturbing family legacies ever recorded in the area. What started as a simple report of a missing person turned into a case that would haunt local police for decades and stay mostly hidden in county records until 1965, when a Duke University graduate student found a bunch of old papers while looking into how families in the Appalachian Mountains were structured. For more than 4 generations, the Harrington family had lived in the same old farmhouse at the end of Blackwater Road. The property was in a narrow valley with steep wooded slopes on either side. By mid-afternoon, the slopes blocked direct sunlight, making the homestead dark too early. There weren't many neighbors, and the closest one was the Carmichael farm, which was about 3 miles down a winding dirt road that often became impassable in the winter. County tax records from 1932 show that the Harrington property was about 120 acres, but most of it was not good for farming because the land was too steep. The family grew a small amount of tobacco, kept a small herd of cattle, and was known to hunt a lot in the woods around their home. The Harringtons were well known in the sparsely populated community because they were very self-sufficient and didn't interact with people outside of their family very often. The first known worries about the Harrington family can be found in church attendance records from the Ravens Hollow Methodist congregation. These records, which are kept in the county historical archives, show that all adult Harringtons went to church regularly until 1919. After that, attendance dropped sharply when Silas Harrington came back from serving in the Great War. By 1925, no family members were listed on the attendance logs, even though going to church was a big part of life in the area at that time. Reverend Isaiah Thornton led the church from 1918 until his death in 1941. He kept detailed notes on his pastoral visits in a leather-bound journal that was found among his personal things in 1960. Thornton described his last visit to the Harrington property in June of 1925, called upon the Harrington household today to inquire after their absence from Sunday services. Silas received me on the porch, but would not invite me inside. His manner was cordial enough, but his eyes held a strange intensity I have not observed in him before. He explained that the family had developed their own private devotions, more suited to their needs. When I offered to provide guidance in this matter, his expression changed in a manner that caused me significant discomfort. I shall respect their wishes to worship in their own way, though I cannot shake the feeling that whatever practice they have adopted bears little resemblance to Christian devotion. Local merchant ledgers found in the general store in Ravens Hollow show that Silas Harrington went into town every month to get supplies. However, these trips became less common between 1934 and 1937. Jeremiah Wade, the owner of the store, wrote in his personal journal that Silas spoke less with each visit, eyes never meeting mine, always scanning the store as if looking for something unseen. Wade's journal entries also describe how Silas's buying habits changed over time, going from buying normal household items to more specialized ones, like large amounts of salt, chemical compounds used in preservation, and special order books on topics ranging from anatomy to ancient religious practices. Silas, his wife Constance, his brother Zachariah, and 2 cousins, Montgomery and Abigail Harrington, made up the family. Census records from 1930 confirm this household composition, but interviews with elderly residents from 1962 suggest that there may have been other family members who were not officially recorded. This difference would later become important to the people who were looking into the case. People in the area say that Constance Harrington used to be a friendly woman who was good at using medicinal herbs and helping women give birth. Many sources say that she helped with births in the community until about 1926, when she suddenly stopped doing so. Sarah Blackburn, who was 89 years old when she was interviewed in 1962, remembered that the last woman Constance helped, Martha Jenkins, had a very hard time giving birth. Blackburn said Martha wasn't the same after that. The child lived for only 3 days. And people didn't talk about the strange things that happened to it. Martha said that Constance had given her something during the birth that made her see terrible things, and that she had heard Constance and Silas talking about the child as if it were some kind of experiment. People didn't believe her when she said she was a midwife again because they thought she was just upset about losing her baby. Before 1937, Montgomery Harrington was the hardest family member to find in public records. Tax records show that he owned a piece of land near Asheville for a short time in the early 1922 before selling it and moving to the family farm. A single photo found in the Asheville Citizen-Times newspaper's archives shows Montgomery at a county agricultural fair in 1922, standing stiffly next to a display of strange cultivated fungi that had won a special award. The article that went with it called him a solitary man of scientific inclination whose innovative cultivation techniques have produced specimens of remarkable size and unusual properties. On the 17th of September 1937, local hunter Wesley Powell didn't come back from a hunting trip in the woods next to the Harrington property. This was the first recorded event that would eventually be linked to the larger Harrington case. Powell, who was good at being outside and knew the area well, had told his wife that he wanted to try hunting in new places, closer to the ridge that looked over the Harrington Valley. 3 days later, Sheriff Edgar Lawson's search party found no sign of Powell except for a single shotgun shell about half a mile from the Harrington property line. Sheriff Lawson's report says that the shell was found in a place where the underbrush had been disturbed, which could mean that there was a fight or that someone had to move quickly through the plants. There were a lot of broken branches along what looked like a trail that went deeper into the woods, but the trail stopped suddenly at a rock face where the tracking dogs lost the scent. Sheriff Lawson's first report, which he filed on the 22nd of September, 1937, says that he talked to Silas Harrington, who said he heard one gunshot around dusk on the 17th, but didn't look into it because hunting sounds are common in these parts. Lawson's notes say that the interview took place on the road leading to the property because Silas didn't want to let me into the house. Lawson thought it was strange that Silas seemed to know about Powell's disappearance before it happened. He wrote about this in his personal notes instead of the official report. Lawson wrote, "Harrington asked if I was asking about the hunter who had gone missing before I said Powell's name. When asked how he knew about a missing hunter, Silas said he had heard it from Montgomery, who had supposedly met another member of the search party the day before. I had told everyone who was looking for me to stay away from the Harrington property until I had finished my interview," I said. The inconsistency was noted, but not acted upon right away. Sheriff Lawson didn't have a lot of resources and didn't have any solid proof that Powell had done anything wrong, so he could only write down his suspicions and keep looking for him, which would turn out to be a waste of time. Ravens Hollow had more rain than usual in October. Weather records for the county show that there was almost twice as much rain as usual, which caused minor flooding and made the mountain roads dangerous. A second disappearance happened during this time. Marion Blackwood, a traveling salesman from Tennessee, was reported missing when he didn't show up at his next scheduled stop in Asheville. His sales route ledger says that on the 9th of October 1937, he was last seen in Ravens Hollow. Blackwood's 1,935 Ford sedan was found abandoned on a turnout about a mile from the Harrington property. The vehicle contained Blackwood's sample case and personal effects, suggesting he had not intended to abandon the car. Sheriff Lawson's report says that the car looked like it had been pulled off the road in an orderly way, with no signs of struggle or being forced to leave. Deputy Samuel Thornton made a detailed list of everything in the car, which showed some strange things. Blackwood's sales ledger showed that he sold pharmaceutical supplies mostly to small-town pharmacies and rural doctors in parts of Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. The last entry in the ledger, dated October 9th, said, "Inquiry from isolated property re-specialized preservation chemicals. Promising lead." There was no client name, but the location description matched the general area around the Harrington homestead. The investigation into Blackwood's disappearance was made harder by the fact that it kept raining. Tracking dogs from a nearby county couldn't find any scent trails beyond the car, and the few footprints that were found nearby had mostly been washed away. This time, Silas Harrington was interviewed again, this time with his brother Zachariah. Both men said they hadn't seen any strange cars or people near their property. Sheriff Lawson's notes from the 14th of October, 1937, say that Zachariah Harrington seemed very upset during the interview. He kept looking toward the homestead and only spoke when directly asked. When asked if a salesman had come to their house, Zachariah quickly said, "We don't need anything from the outside," and then didn't say anything else for the rest of the interview. Sheriff Lawson said that Zachariah looked very different from the last time he saw him, which was a few months ago at the general store. He wrote, "Z. Harrington's complexion has taken on a grayish pallor, and his movements show a curious stiffness, especially in the neck and shoulders." When asked about his health, Silas Harrington said that his brother had been suffering from mountain rheumatics and was getting treatment. Lawson was particularly interested in Zachariah's hands because they had calluses and stains that suggested he had done a lot of manual labor, even though he was supposed to have a joint problem. When Lawson tried to ask more about the visitors to the property, Silas ended the interview, saying they had to go back and do chores before it got dark. Lawson watched as the men left. Even though it was pouring rain, neither of them had enough protection against the weather. They didn't seem to care that they got soaked on the way back to their property. By November 1937, Ravens Hollow was filled with a sense of unease. Records from the local Methodist church show that there were several services where people prayed for the missing men. A short article from the local newspaper archives, dated the 8th of November 1937, has Sheriff Lawson telling people to be alert, but not to believe rumors about the recent disappearances. The article didn't say what these unfounded rumors were about, but interviews with people who lived there decades later suggest that people were talking about the Harrington family. In a 1964 interview, Meredith Jenkins, who was 16 years old in 1937, said that her father had told the family not to go near the Harrington property because those folks ain't right and never have been. Another resident, Harold Cooper, told a scary story about something that happened to his father in late October 1937. Cooper said that his father had been coming back from a nearby town after dark when he saw what he called a procession of lanterns moving through the woods near the Harrington property. He stopped his truck out of curiosity and watched from a distance. Cooper's dad said he saw at least 6 figures moving in a straight line between the trees, but he couldn't see their faces in the dark. What bothered him the most was that the lanterns moved in a way that seemed unnatural for people to move, even though the ground was uneven and there was a lot of thick underbrush. The investigation took a big turn on the 23rd of November 1937, when local farmer Everett Carmichael told police about a strange encounter. Sheriff Lawson's report says that Carmichael was looking for some missing cows when he saw strange things happening on the Harrington property from a ridge that looked down on the valley. Carmichael said that all 5 of the known Harrington family members were working on what looked like building something behind the main house, even after dark with lanterns. According to the sheriff's report, what bothered Carmichael was not the building itself, but the fact that there were at least 3 other people helping with the work, who he couldn't identify as known members of the community. When Carmichael returned the following day to continue his search for the missing cattle, he noticed that the partially constructed structure was now covered with canvas tarps, obscuring it from view. The county archives have Carmichael's statement, which has more information than the official report. He said that he watched the work through binoculars and that all the people moved with the same strange stiffness that he had seen in Zachariah Harrington when they met by chance at the property line a few weeks before. What bothered him even more was that the unknown people seemed to be wearing clothes that didn't fit right, as if they weren't used to wearing them. One person's movements were so awkward that Carmichael thought at first that it was a person with a serious physical disability. Sheriff Lawson had been getting more and more worrying reports but didn't have enough proof to take official action, so he decided to go to the Harrington property himself. He made his first official visit to the Harrington homestead on the 25th of November 1937, with deputies Samuel Thornton and James Whitaker. The report that was filed later says that the property was in a state of controlled disarray. The main house, which was built in the late 1800s and has 2 floors, had been changed a lot. Several windows were boarded over, and there was what looked like a new addition coming from the back. The deputy saw several outbuildings in different states of repair, such as a big barn, 2 storage sheds, a smokehouse, and the structure that Carmichael had seen that was not finished yet. The newest building was about 50 yards behind the main house and was partly hidden by a group of pine trees. There were no windows in the rough-hewn wood building, and it had a single heavy door that was locked with several locks. Silas Harrington said that the building Carmichael saw was just a new smokehouse for the winter when he was asked about it. Sheriff Lawson asked to see this building, but Silas said it wasn't ready to be shown yet, according to his report. When asked who the extra workers were, Silas got very nervous and only said they were distant relations passing through. The report says that during the conversation, which took place in the front yard of the property, all other family members stayed inside the house, even though it was mid-afternoon on a clear day. Deputy Thornton said he saw movement behind the curtains in several windows, which made him think that they were being watched during the interview. Deputy Whitaker wrote in a follow-up note that the condition of the property's animals was the most disturbing thing he saw. Whitaker said that the cattle, while there were enough of them, seemed unnaturally calm and had what he called vacant stares. What worried him more were the animals that had been kept alone in separate pens. Whitaker thought these animals were sick at first because they had strange physical traits, like patchy hair loss, misshapen limbs, and in one case, what looked like an extra appendage sticking out of the shoulder area. Silas said that these animals had a mountain malady that affects cattle in these parts, and that they were being kept apart to keep the disease from spreading. Deputy Whitaker, who grew up on a farm and knew a lot about common livestock diseases, said he had never seen or heard of a natural illness with these symptoms. Sheriff Lawson could only write down what he saw and leave because there wasn't enough reason for a search warrant at the time. At the end of his report, he says something personal. Something unwholesome permeates the Harrington property, though I cannot place the exact nature of my discomfort. After this visit, Lawson started putting together a more complete file on the Harrington family by getting historical records and statements from people who had lived there for a long time. This unofficial investigation, which he mostly did on his own time, showed him several patterns that made him even more worried. Death records from the county showed that from 1,920 to 1,930, 9 members of the Harrington family had died. This was a very high death rate for the time. The reasons given were vague, such as natural decline, wasting ailment, or unknown causes. It is important to note that the county coroner did not look into any of the deaths. Instead, death certificates were signed by either Silas Harrington himself or, in 2 cases, a doctor from Asheville who had since moved to another state. Property records showed that the Harrington family had slowly bought more land around their original homestead. They often bought parcels at prices lower than the market value from owners who were eager to sell. One of these deals, which took place in 1933, involved a 30-acre piece of land that was right next to the main property. Joseph Merritt, the previous owner, is said to have had bad dreams and livestock deaths that he couldn't explain before selling the land and moving to Ohio. Lawson's most important discovery was a series of strange orders that Silas Harrington placed through the general store starting in 1930. These included chemical compounds that are usually used in science or medicine, specialized tools that didn't seem like they would be useful for regular farm work, and books on a wide range of topics, from comparative anatomy to ancient mystical practices. One order from early 1937 was for an unusually large amount of salt, formaldehyde, and special glass containers. These are things that are used to keep biological specimens safe. In western North Carolina, the winter of 1937-1938 was especially bad. Weather records show that temperatures were much lower than normal, and that snowfall cut off many mountain communities for weeks at a time. During this time, there were no more reports of people going missing, and the Harrington family didn't come to town, which wasn't unusual because of the weather and their independent way of life. Sheriff Lawson used this time to talk to law enforcement officers in nearby counties and states to find out if there had been any other disappearances or strange family groups that fit the Harrington profile. Most of the answers were negative, but a sheriff from eastern Tennessee did talk about a case from 1,932 inches, which a traveling agricultural inspector went missing while visiting farms in remote areas. People named Harrison owned the property where the man's government car was found abandoned. These people were said to be reclusive and not welcoming to outsiders. The Harrison family had moved by the time the authorities looked into it more. They left behind a home with strange changes to the cellar area, such as what looked like restraints attached to the walls. But when spring came, people in Ravens Hollow saw that the Harringtons were acting differently. General store records show that Silas started going to town more often and buying more supplies than usual. The store owner's journal entry from the 12th of April 1938 says that Silas looked thin and worn out for his age, and that his hand showed signs of work beyond the usual farming work, with strange calluses and stains. What was even more interesting was that Montgomery, Silas's cousin, was now going on these trips with him. Montgomery was someone who had rarely been seen in town before. Several people said that Montgomery was tall and thin, had a stiff posture, and tended to stand too close to people when he talked to them. In a letter to his sister that was found in 1964, Harold Griffin, the postmaster, said that Montgomery Harrington had asked about mail service to places as far away as Oklahoma and Missouri because they had family there. Several witnesses said that Montgomery acted strangely during these visits. Martha Wilson, who worked at the general store, said in a later interview that Montgomery would sometimes stop speaking in the middle of a sentence and stay completely still for several seconds before starting again, as if nothing had happened. She also noticed that he spoke in a strange way, saying that it was too precise, like each word was being chosen one at a time instead of flowing naturally. Dr. William Foster, the town's doctor, had the most disturbing story. He ran into Montgomery at the post office in late April 1938. Foster's medical journal says that he saw what looked like a surgical cut along Montgomery's jawline. It was partly hidden by his collar, but could be seen when he turned his head. When Foster asked Montgomery about the wound in a professional way and offered to help, Montgomery said, "It is not a wound, doctor. It is an improvement." Before Foster could ask more questions, Silas stepped in and said that Montgomery had been hurt and needed treatment in Asheville, and he quickly led his cousin out of the building. On the 3rd of May, 1938, Virginia Powell, the wife of Wesley Powell, who was still missing, made a disturbing discovery that changed the course of the investigation. She found a journal she didn't know existed while cleaning out her husband's hunting cabin to get it ready to sell. The journal, which had entries from several years ago, showed that Wesley had been interested in the Harrington family long before he went missing. Sheriff Lawson's report says that the journal showed Powell's notes on what he saw of the Harrington property from different places in the forest around it. Virginia Powell also gave Sheriff Lawson a map from the journal that her husband had marked with several observation points around the Harrington property and what he thought were underground features, shown by dotted lines going from the main house to different outbuildings. Virginia Powell also gave Sheriff Lawson a map she found in the journal. Her husband had marked several observation points around the Harrington property and what he thought were underground features with dotted lines that went from the main house to different outbuildings. The entries talked about strange behavior, like what Powell called night gatherings, when several lanterns could be seen moving between the main house and the outbuildings in what looked like organized patterns. The journal didn't say how Powell knew about these supposed tunnels, but one entry talked about unusual depressions in the soil after the spring thaw, which could mean that digging happened below. With this new information, Sheriff Lawson got a warrant to search the Harrington property. On the 7th of May, 1938, he and 4 deputies went to the Harrington family's house, but it looked like they had already left. There were signs that the property had been left quickly, like doors that were left open and personal items that were all over the place. When you walked into the main house, it was a scary sight. The front rooms looked pretty normal, though they were bare and had simple furniture and few personal touches. But as the deputies went deeper into the building, they found more and more disturbing changes. The back room, which could only be reached through a heavy door with several locks, looked like a makeshift lab. The official report included Deputy Thornton's inventory, which listed glass containers of different sizes, surgical tools, and specialized equipment whose purpose was not clear right away. There were a lot of jars with preserved specimens that looked like organs and tissue samples from unknown sources. This was the most disturbing thing. Some of the items had labels in a code that couldn't be easily broken, while others had what Deputy Thornton called biological material that showed signs of mutations or changes that were not normal for the way things grow. The search that came next found the first real proof that something very bad had happened on the Harrington property. Investigators found a secret door in a root cellar under the main house that led to a network of tunnels that went deep into the hillside behind the property. These tunnels, which were carefully supported by wooden beams, linked several underground rooms of different sizes. Investigators found what looked like a workshop in one room, which the official report said was about 15 feet square. It had strange tools, glass containers of unknown use, and long journals written in a cipher or code unlike anything I've encountered, according to Deputy Thornton. They were unable to figure out what the journals meant at the time. There were personal items in another room that were later linked to both Wesley Powell and Marion Blackwood, the missing salesman. The search found Powell's hunting knife and Blackwood's monogrammed handkerchief, but no human remains were found. Deputy Whitaker's part of the report talks about a room with 7 metal tables lined up in a row. Each table had restraints and drainage systems that led to collection vessels. The surfaces looked like they had been cleaned a lot, but the stains that were still there suggested that they had been used for bodily fluids for a long time. Next to this room was a smaller one with shelves of glass jars. Many of them were empty, but some still had preserved specimens in them that were labeled with the same unreadable code. Sheriff Lawson's report says that the most disturbing thing they found was a big room at the end of the tunnel system. 7 stone slabs were set up in a circle in this room, which was about 20 feet in diameter and had a domed ceiling. Each slab had strange carvings on it and was very stained. A chemist from Asheville looked at the stains again and found that at least some of them were consistent with human blood. In the middle of this circle was a pedestal made of rough-hewn stone that held a metal device that couldn't be identified right away. The device was about 3 feet tall and made up of brass pieces that fit together, glass tubes, and what looked like electrical parts, though there was no clear source of power. When Sheriff Lawson tried to get a better look at the device, he said he felt very dizzy and confused, and it didn't go away until he left the room. It took almost a week to fully dig up the tunnel system, and during that time, they found more chambers that seemed to serve different purposes, such as storing chemicals in what looked like living quarters with simple bedding. One discovery that was especially troubling was a small room with clothes that were the right size for people who were not known to be part of the Harrington family. Some of the clothes were the same as those worn by Wesley Powell and Marion Blackwood on the days they went missing. The investigation that followed was thorough for the time, but the sheriff's department in a rural area in the late 1932 didn't have a lot of resources. There was a bulletin asking for the Harrington family's arrest, but there were never any confirmed sightings. The case files show that questions were sent to police in Tennessee, Virginia, Georgia, and other nearby states, but none of the answers led to any useful information. Some of the things that were found on the property were sent to state-level experts for analysis. A preliminary report from the state chemist's office, dated June 12, 1938, listed many compounds found in the lab, some of which were said to be consistent with experimental medical research, but were put together in strange ways. The report specifically mentioned the presence of chemicals used to preserve things, different anesthetics, and chemicals that are usually used to prepare tissue samples for microscopic examination. The state chemist couldn't easily figure out what some of the mixtures were, which was even more confusing. The report says, Sample 17B has parts that look like they come from living things, maybe fungi, but they have been changed in ways that are not known. The compound has structural similarities to some neurotoxins, but its exact effects can't be known without more testing. I should also mention that lab staff reported strange sensory experiences when they handled this substance, such as vivid auditory hallucinations and a constant feeling of being watched. The government took control of the property, and only people who were allowed to be there could get in. But because of budget problems, it wasn't possible to have regular patrols of the remote area. Maintenance records show that county officials checked on the property every 3 months until 1942, when the war made it harder to keep an eye on things. Sheriff Lawson kept looking into the Harrington case until he retired in 1946, but he didn't get as much official help as he used to. As the years went by, his personal files, which were given to the County Historical Society after he died in 1952, showed that he kept in touch with police officers in several states. He did this to keep track of reports of missing people and strange family groups that might be linked to the Harringtons. Lawson wrote to his successor in December 1946, I cannot in good conscience leave this office without expressing my firm belief that the Harrington matter represents an ongoing threat. What we discovered in those tunnels suggests activities so far beyond the bounds of human decency that they can scarcely be contemplated, yet the family themselves eluded justice. I am convinced they merely relocated to continue their work elsewhere, and that similar disappearances will follow wherever they establish themselves. I urge you to maintain vigilance regarding reports that may connect to this case, particularly those involving missing persons in isolated rural areas and sightings of individuals exhibiting the peculiar physical characteristics associated with the Harrington family. Dr. Malcolm Reynolds, a cultural anthropologist from Duke University, did work that helped solve the case. Otherwise, it might have stayed just another unsolved mystery in Appalachian history. Reynolds found references to the Harrington case in county records while looking into isolated family structures in the Appalachian region in 1963. Reynolds was interested in the strange details and got permission to talk to people who still lived in Ravens Hollow and had lived there during the time in question. These interviews, which took place in 1964, showed more background information that had never been officially recorded. Reynolds' research notes say that the Harrington family has had a reputation for strange behavior since the early 1900s. People who lived there longer remembered that the family had always kept to themselves, but that they had become even more isolated after Silas came back from serving in the Great War in 1919. Several people who were interviewed said they had heard rumors that Silas had brought something back with him from Europe, but none of them could explain what this meant. Jacob Merritt, an old man whose family used to own land next to the Harringtons but sold it in 1933, told Reynolds a scary story that had been passed down from his father. This family story says that Silas came back from the war changed in ways that went beyond the normal problems of war. Merritt's father saw Silas not long after he got back and noticed strange scars on his forearms that Silas said were from a gas attack. But the way the scars were arranged seemed more like deliberate cuts than chemical burns. Silas was seen looking at these marks with apparent satisfaction instead of distress on several occasions. Reynolds found out through church records that the Harrington family used to be a lot bigger, which is probably the most important thing he found out. Baptismal records from 1880 to 1910 showed that at least 14 people had the last name Harrington. But by the 1930 census, only 5 of them were still alive. When Reynolds asked about this difference, he found that everyone was hesitant to talk about it, as he wrote in his notes. One old resident, who asked to remain anonymous, finally said that the Harrington family had a number of strange illnesses in the 1,920 seconds that were never explained. These diseases are said to have caused strange changes in behavior and physical condition before finally killing the person. During this time, the family had called local doctor Dr. Samuel Grant to the property several times, but he had been turned away more and more as they started to care for themselves. Reynolds found Dr. Grant's medical journal with the doctor's daughter. It had some troubling observations in it. In an entry dated July 1924, Grant described treating a young Harrington woman, first name illegible, possibly Clara or Cora, who exhibited an alarming rigidity of the limbs and unusual pallor, accompanied by periods of lucidity interspersed with incomprehensible ramblings about the change coming from within. A subsequent entry dated September 1924 noted, "Visited the Harrington property today to check on Clara's condition, only to be informed by Silas that she had passed during the night. When I requested to examine the body, as is customary to determine cause of death, I was told that they had already prepared her for burial according to family traditions that precluded outside intervention. I found this highly irregular and expressed as much, at which point Zachariah emerged from the house in a state of considerable agitation. His appearance shocked me, as he displayed several of the same symptoms I had observed in Clara: the unnatural pallor, stiffened gait, and a peculiar flatness of affect. When I offered to examine him, Silas intervened most forcefully, stating that the family takes care of its own, and requesting that I leave the property." Dr. Grant's last note about the Harrington family, from September 1926, said, "I fear what is happening in that household is beyond medical science as we understand it. There is something deeply unnatural in the progression of symptoms, and in my darkest thoughts, I question whether these deaths are entirely unwelcome to Silas and his inner circle. I have consulted medical texts regarding similar presentations but can find no recognized disease that accounts for the specific constellation of symptoms. Most troubling is my growing suspicion that whatever afflicts the Harringtons may be deliberately cultivated rather than merely suffered." In early 1965, Reynolds' investigation took a big turn when he got permission to look at the Harrington property again. The government had been keeping an eye on it, but it hadn't been thoroughly inspected in years. The main house had fallen down because no one took care of it, but the tunnel system, which was protected from the weather, was mostly still there. Reynolds and a team from Duke University carefully explored the underground chambers with better tools than Sheriff Lawson had in 1938. Ground-penetrating radar found more tunnels that weren't found during the first search. One of these tunnels looked like it had been intentionally collapsed. When dug up, this tunnel led to a room that Reynolds called evidence of extensive experimentation of an unknown nature. The room had lab equipment that looked like a mix of regular medical tools and custom-made tools whose purpose was not clear. The specimens in the glass containers were thought to be animal in origin at first, but later tests would raise troubling questions about this idea. The most important find was a set of photographic plates kept in a sealed metal box. These pictures, which had gotten worse over time and because of the weather, showed what looked like systematic surgical changes made to people. Reynolds' report talks about changes to anatomical structures that got worse over time and experimental grafting procedures that were way beyond what was normal for medicine at the time. Because these pictures were so disturbing, federal authorities quickly classified and secured them after being told about the discoveries. The most important thing the team found was a hidden compartment in the wall that held a leather-bound journal that the first investigators had missed. This journal was written in plain English, unlike the coded ones that were found earlier. It looks like Zachariah Harrington wrote it. The journal, which covered the years 1935 to late 1937, was the first clear look at the strange things the Harrington family was doing. Reynolds' analysis says that the journal showed how Zachariah was becoming more and more worried about the experiments that Silas and Montgomery were doing. The entries talk about something called the transformation, which seems to have started after Silas came back from Europe with what Zachariah called the ancient knowledge. The journal said that the first Harringtons thought they had found a way to go beyond the limits of the human body by using a mix of chemicals and rituals. Early entries talk about tests done on animals, but later ones are more disturbing because they talk about family members who were embraced the necessity of sacrifice for advancement. As the journal goes on, Zachariah's writing becomes more and more agitated, showing both interest and horror at the results of the experiments. He wrote in an entry from August 1937, "What came out of the chamber today can no longer be called Cousin Abigail in any true sense, though it moves with purpose and keeps some of her memories." Silas says this is just the transitional phase and that the final form will be glorious, but I can't shake the feeling that we have crossed a line that should not have been crossed. The journal has a lot of information about the physical and mental changes that family members went through during the transformation process. Zachariah talked about how his skin texture, joint flexibility, and cognitive function changed over time. He was most worried about changes in behavior, such as what he called the fading of human sentiment and the rise of a collective consciousness that is stronger than individual identity. A particularly disturbing entry from September 1937 said, "The process has been greatly improved since the first attempts, which led to death and deterioration. The key, as Silas found out, is not to force the change, but to get the body ready to accept it willingly. When the fungal compound is grown and mixed with the chemical agents found in European texts, it causes a gradual change instead of a catastrophic one." Montgomery's work in adapting the formula for different physiologies has been very important, but I question the ethics of his methods. The last entries make it clear that Zachariah was getting more and more worried about Silas's plans to bring in outsiders to help with the family's work. The last dated entry, from the 10th of November, 1937, says in a cryptic way, "The hunter gave me unexpected insights into the process of transformation in people who are not of our bloodline." The traveling man, less so. Silas now talks about finding more suitable subjects, those whose disappearance might not draw attention so easily. "I fear I have contributed to something that cannot be undone." Reynolds's report to the University Ethics Committee, which was written in March 1965, said that the federal government should be told about his findings. But university leaders were worried about bad press and insisted on more proof before bringing in outside groups. This delay in the bureaucracy would have big effects. When federal agents finally got to the Harrington property in June 1965, they found that the site had been broken into. The entrance to the tunnel system had been opened, and there were signs that someone had been systematically taking things out of the underground chambers. Most importantly, Zachariah's journal was missing, and the only proof of what it said was Reynolds's notes and copied parts of it. Federal officials kept the investigation secret, and many details have never been made public. Interviews with retired investigators done for a historical society project in the early 1992, however, show that at least 17 disappearances in 5 states between 1938 and 1965 had things in common that could link them to the Harrington case. People who matched descriptions of Silas or Montgomery Harrington, but always under different names, were last seen near remote rural properties that had been bought by these people. In some cases, abandoned buildings had signs of quickly taken apart lab equipment and changes to the structure that were similar to those at the original Harrington homestead. In 1944, in eastern Kentucky, local police, looking into a string of livestock mutilations, found a deserted farmhouse that had been left alone just before they got there. Samuel Harrison, who lived next door and was described as tall and stiff in his movements with an unusually precise way of speaking, had bought the property 2 years earlier. These details match those of Montgomery Harrington. The sheriff's report said that the farmhouse seller had a makeshift lab with signs of chemical experiments and surgery, as well as diagrams of human and animal anatomy that were written in a code or cipher. In 1952, a case from southern Missouri showed a more direct link. A hunter in the Ozarks said he found a remote cabin where he saw strange things happening, such as what looked like medical procedures being done on people who were tied up. 3 days later, when the police looked into it, they found the cabin empty but with evidence that matched the Harrington case. This included journals written in the same code as the ones found at the original homestead and specialized tools that matched descriptions of things that had been taken from the North Carolina property. The stories from police officers who looked into these properties were probably the most disturbing. Several reports said that experienced officers felt a strong sense of dread when they entered certain rooms, especially root cellars and basement areas. An anonymous Missouri detective said in the Historical Society records, "I've never been in a place that felt so wrong as that cellar in 20 years of police work. It wasn't just the evidence of what had happened there. It was as if the air itself had been tainted by it." In 1968, the case got a lot of attention again when construction workers clearing land for a new highway about 30 miles from the original Harrington property found human remains in a remote cave system. Forensic analysis, limited by the technology of the time, suggested the remains belonged to at least 3 individuals and showed unusual signs of post-mortem modification that the medical examiner's report described as consistent with extensive surgical alteration. The report detailed anomalies, including evidence of precise incisions along major muscle groups, unusual reinforcement of the skeletal structure with unidentified metallic elements, and modifications to the cranium that suggested deliberate reshaping of a nature inconsistent with any known medical or cultural practice. The soft tissue was the most confusing part because it showed very little signs of decomposition, even though the medical examiner thought the remains had been in the cave for at least 10 years. A pocket watch found with the remains was later identified as belonging to Marion Blackwood, a salesman who went missing in 1937. The forensic report said that the most puzzling part of the discovery was that the changes to the remains seemed to have been made while the people were still alive, as there were signs of healing around some of the changes. The report said that the nature and extent of these changes are not explained by standard medical practice. At this point, the original investigation had been going on for more than 30 years, and many of the people who were involved in it at the beginning had either retired or died. Sheriff Lawson died in 1952, never solving what he called the case that haunted my dreams in his personal papers. His successor didn't seem interested in going back to what was seen as a historical curiosity rather than an investigation. Dr. Reynolds kept working on his research until he died suddenly in 1969, which was officially said to be from a heart attack. Dr. Evelyn Whitman, a colleague of Reynolds's who helped him analyze the materials from the Harrington property, wrote to Reynolds's family to say that he had become more and more paranoid in the months leading up to his death. He thought he was being watched and that someone had accessed his research materials when he wasn't there. In a letter dated just 2 weeks before his death, Reynolds wrote to Whitman, "I am increasingly convinced that what the Harrington family started did not end with their disappearance, but has continued to spread in ways we have not yet understood. The changes they made were not just physical. They affected something more fundamental to human nature. Most troubling is my growing suspicion that people connected to this case may be watching my research, maybe even from within the university itself. There is a faculty member in the biology department whose mannerisms and physical characteristics bear an unsettling resemblance to descriptions of Montgomery Harrington, though he claims to have been born in Oregon and has documentation to support this assertion. After Reynolds died, Duke University got his detailed notes on the Harrington case. But when Dr. Whitman tried to get these materials for a planned publication in 1970, she found that a lot of them were missing. For example, all of Zachariah's journal entries and the detailed analysis of the lab equipment found in the hidden chambers were missing. The university said that Reynolds had never sent these specific items to the archive, even though Dr. Whitman said she had helped pack them up for storage. The university turned down her requests for an investigation, and in the end, they said that Reynolds's work on the Harrington case was mostly based on guesswork and not very scholarly, which made his findings less credible. Dr. Whitman quit her job not long after and mostly stopped being involved in academic life. In a rare 1978 interview with a local newspaper, she said in a vague way, "Some truths are deliberately buried, not because they can't be proved, but because their implications are too disturbing to acknowledge." The interview was supposed to continue in a later issue, but the follow-up was never published, and researchers were unable to find Whitman in later years. The government still owned the Harrington property until 1972, when it was sold at auction because of budget cuts. The buyer, a Charlotte-based development company, wanted to clear the land to build vacation homes. But the project was put on hold after a number of accidents happened during the first clearing work, such as equipment failures and a fire that destroyed a temporary office building for no apparent reason. A local historian interviewed workers who worked on the project in the 1,980 seconds and found that the site had strange problems from the start. When trying to dig up certain areas, especially near the collapsed tunnel system, heavy machinery often broke down. Several workers said they felt strange physical sensations, like dizziness, confusion, and even vivid hallucinations when they worked in certain areas of the property. Raymond Davies, the project foreman, wrote about a very disturbing event in which a bulldozer operator tried to clear the area where the main house had been. Morris had been working that section for maybe an hour when he suddenly stopped the machine and just sat there, staring straight ahead. When I approached to see what the problem was, I noticed he was sweating profusely despite the cool temperature. He didn't respond to my calls, and when I climbed up to check on him, his eyes were open but completely unfocused. I had to physically shake him to get any response. At which point, he began speaking rapidly about seeing through different eyes and feeling the change starting. We got him to a hospital in Asheville, where he was diagnosed with heat exhaustion. Though the day was overcast and mild, Morris had no recollection of the incident afterward and refused to return to the site. Over the next few decades, the land changed hands several more times, but no development was ever finished. Local real estate agents are said to have been hesitant to list the property because of its bad history and the fact that the land was hard to work with. By the middle of the 1,980 seconds, the area had mostly been reclaimed by forest, and only the stone foundation of the original house and some broken-down outbuildings were still visible. In 1992, a group of spelunkers who were exploring caves in the area found what looked like a man-made tunnel that had fallen down. They were curious, so they partially cleared the entrance and found a narrow passage that led to what they called a chamber with strange stone fixtures. They had to go back because the entrance to the tunnel partially collapsed, which stopped them from going any further. When they came back the next day with more materials, they found that the tunnel had been completely sealed by a bigger collapse. Joseph Merrick, one of the group members, later told park rangers that he had heard movement sounds coming from the sealed tunnel as they were leaving the area. However, his friends denied hearing anything strange. Merrick became obsessed with the site and kept going back to try to find the tunnel entrance again. Merrick's girlfriend, Sarah Coleman, says that he started having vivid nightmares and became very interested in strange medical procedures and changing his body. Coleman said that Merrick's personality changed in small ways, such as his speech becoming more precise and his movements becoming strangely still, which made her more and more uneasy. Merrick went missing in December 1992 while hiking alone in the area. There was a long search, but no sign of him was ever found, other than his empty tent and a journal with entries that became more and more disjointed about voices from beneath the mountain. The last entry in the journal, dated the 12th of December 1992, said, "I understand now. The Harringtons weren't making monsters. They were becoming something else entirely, something that could wait patiently in the dark for decades. I hear them moving below. Tonight, I'll meet them." For weeks, people looked for Merrick, but they didn't find anything. According to ranger reports, search dogs acted strangely in some areas, getting upset and refusing to move even when their handlers told them to. They used ground-penetrating radar to look for possible cave systems where Merrick might have fallen, but the results were inconclusive because the technical report said there were unusual interference patterns of unknown origin. The Harrington case has become a local legend, and it sometimes comes up in collections of Appalachian mysteries or academic papers about small mountain towns. Official records are still incomplete, with important documents missing and others heavily redacted when you request them through the Freedom of Information Act. There is no doubt that something very bad happened on the Harrington property between 1937 and 1938. At least 2 men who were connected to the family went missing, and there was physical evidence that suggested activities that were far beyond what is acceptable for people to do. The family's disappearance and the possible links to later cases in several states suggest a dark legacy that may not yet be fully resolved. What is still unknown about the case is probably the most disturbing thing about it. It has never been possible to map the whole tunnel system, and it is still not clear what kind of change Zachariah's journal talks about. The altered human remains discovered in 1968 raise questions that might not have a clear answer, even with today's forensic methods. A historian looking into Appalachian folk practices found a story in a collection of local legends about a family that changed themselves to escape death sometime in the early 20th century. The story said that these Everses people still walk among us, wearing faces that almost resemble our own, learning our ways while waiting for the time when they no longer need to hide. The historian thought this was just a typical piece of folklore, a story that grew out of exaggerated accounts of the real Harrington case. But one thing makes me think. The local story said that these beings could be recognized by their subtle rigidity in their movements and a tendency to speak in unusually precise, measured tones. This is similar to how Montgomery Harrington was described in accounts from 1938. In a retirement interview from 2011, a retired federal agent who had worked on the case in 1965 said something strange. When asked about cases that were still open, he only briefly mentioned the Harrington case. He said, "Some investigations are closed not because they're solved, but because the truth is deemed too dangerous for public consumption. I'll say only this. I believe descendants of that family still exist, though descendants may not be the right word for what they've become." The agent wouldn't say anything else and died unexpectedly 3 weeks later from what was ruled to be natural causes. Within hours of his death, unidentified government officials reportedly took his personal files, which coworkers thought had unofficial notes on the Harrington case, from his home. Today, the land where the Harrington homestead used to be is part of a national forest preserve. It's not shown on official maps, and local guides and hunters are said to stay away from it. A few people who say they have been to the area say it is eerily quiet. There are no animals, and they always feel like someone is watching them just out of sight. Laboratory tests on samples from this specific location showed unusual fungal spores with what the research paper called novel structural characteristics and potential bioactive properties. When cultured in the lab, these fungi grew in ways that the researchers said were seemingly responsive to external stimuli in a manner more typically associated with simple nervous systems than fungal organisms. However, before more research could be done, the university lab was broken into and the cultures and all research notes were stolen. A graduate student studying the composition of soil in the area took samples from different places in the National Forest in 2013, including the area where the old Harrington property used to be. The only thing found was a piece of paper in the researcher's desk drawer that said, "Some doors should stay closed." The transformation continues. The handwriting on the note was said by the student to not belong to anyone who worked in the lab. We may never fully understand what the Harrington family left behind. What started as a missing persons case in a small mountain town has turned into something that makes us question what we know about people. The remaining pieces of evidence point to possibilities that are too scary to fully think about. That people in those remote mountains found a way to change themselves into something that is no longer fully human, and that this change may still be going on, hidden in the shadows of rural America. It might be better if some mysteries stay that way, and some doors stay shut. But for the few who have seen the truth behind the Harrington case, there is the unsettling knowledge that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And deep in the Appalachian Mountains, something waits, patient and watchful. It is neither fully alive nor fully dead, but it has changed forever. As you think about this story about the Harrington family, think about the far-off places near your own community, where strange things might go unnoticed for years. Think about the strangers you meet whose movements seem a little off and whose expressions never quite reach their eyes. Maybe, just maybe, you should pay more attention to the old stories about families who found ways to cheat death through both old and strange means. In the most remote areas of our world, in the darkest corners of human experience, there are possibilities that our logical minds would rather not think about. These are possibilities that the Harrington family may have taken on at a great cost to themselves and to us.